Picking a laptop can be a hard decision, whether you're trying to get one for work or just for personal use. That's why I'm glad to be talking with Windows and hardware expert Ed Bott about how to make that decision. So Ed, let's jump right into it. What are some of the major considerations that people should think about when they go to buy a new laptop?
Well, thanks, Bill. This is a list that I put together because I was in the market for a new laptop myself, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget about some of the things that were most important. So I wrote this stuff down and liked the results so much that I decided to share it with our readers. And the very, very, very first decision that people have to make is which platform are you going to use on your laptop? People say that Macs and PCs are interchangeable these days. I'm going to argue that's not true. Most people have chosen either Windows or a Mac, and whichever one of those decisions you make is going to determine which way you go next. Now, if you're a Mac person, you've got a fairly limited number of choices that you make. Now, the interesting thing about a Mac, of course, is that it can run Windows either through Boot Camp or in a virtual environment. But if you're planning to use a PC mostly for Windows, I recommend that you get one that was designed for use with Windows. You'll be happiest that way. Second big sort of platform decision you have to make is about the display. Now, there are some configuration options here, but mostly they're inherent in the device itself that you choose. And those are things like the size. If you want a 15-inch or even larger display, this is the time to choose it. Do you want a touch screen? There are still plenty of traditional laptops that don't have a touch screen, and even with Windows 10, you can get by without touch if that's your preference. You might even get a little better battery life out of it. There's a question of resolution. Do you want a standard, like a full HD resolution, or do you want one of the quad resolution ones that have a really, really sharp display, but again, tend to use more power? And then finally, one thing that people don't think about a lot is the aspect ratio. Most conventional laptops have a 16:9 ratio, but there are a number of models out there today, the Microsoft Surface line in particular, that have a 3:2 aspect ratio. And then there are some like Dell's XPS 13 that are in between and have a 16:10 aspect ratio. I personally prefer the more squarish aspect ratios, that 3:2, just because it lets you see two things side by side. But if you're a gamer or a movie watcher, you probably want the 16:9 aspect ratio. And then finally, there's the question of weight and form factor. Do you want a traditional clamshell laptop, just close it up, stick it in your bag? Or do you want a 2-in-1 device that either folds over like one of the Lenovo Yoga devices or splits apart like a Microsoft Surface? So those are the sort of the key questions you have to make first, and that's going to help you narrow the list down so that we can start talking about specs.
One of the things that I didn't hear you mention when you were talking about platforms is Chrome. Chromebooks gained a lot of attention several years ago. Most people you see now use Chromebooks in educational settings, in sort of field settings sometimes, where you're looking for a low-cost endpoint. Where do those fit into the Windows, Apple debate?
Well, I think you can throw iPad in there as well, because there are people who are perfectly capable of getting all the work they need to do accomplished on an iPad with a keyboard adapter or on a Chromebook. But in both of those cases, you're limiting yourself to a specific range of tasks. And in my experience, Chromebooks are great if you're if you're a G Suite type person, if you live in the Google environment. iPad is great if you're really comfortable in the Apple environment. But those are still, for most of us who are in the business world, those are still companion devices for a full strength PC or Mac, something that can, where you can run the software of your choosing on it and do tasks that break out of the browser. But yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, so let's jump right into, you were just talking about power, right? And especially around business users. So you were talking about specs, and that's the next big bullet point on your list. What are some of the things when it comes to processor speed, when it comes to RAM, when it comes to storage, that you really encourage people to look for when they're buying a new laptop?
Sure. So one of the first things that I suggest people look for is the battery size and battery life, because that's, the whole reason you own a laptop typically is because you want to move it from place to place. You're going to travel with it. You're going to use it on an airplane, in a conference room, in a hotel room, or whatever. So you have to decide, how much time am I going to be spending away from AC power? And so how much battery life do I need? And there are often different sizes of batteries that you can get. Ironically, the larger displays, if you get a laptop with a 15-inch display, that bigger case means you can put a bigger battery in it, which means it might be heavier, but it's also going to last longer in terms of activity. So battery life is probably one of the most important things that I suggest people look at. But you really have to start from being honest about how much battery life you really need. Next up is CPU and GPU. And I found that most people tend to overestimate how much they're going to use the CPU and underestimate how much the GPU matters. In general, when you're looking for a Windows laptop or a Mac, your choices are going to come down to an Intel Core processor, an i5 or an i7. And the processor speed itself doesn't matter that much, as long as you are getting one of the more recent generations of that. So right now, the Intel Core family is in the 10th generation, and I would say anything 8th generation or later should be acceptable for most people. And don't worry too much about the speed unless you are doing the kind of really aggressive processing, like video processing or something, where you absolutely need that horsepower. But for everyday productivity tasks, for most people, an i5 processor will run cooler, last longer, and get the job done just the same as some big i7 with a very high clock speed. GPU these days, fortunately, built-in graphics on the Intel platform have gotten much, much better, and they're good enough to take care of most productivity tasks. However, if you're a gamer, or if you're doing video processing or photo processing or extensive calculations for things like CAD, you really need a discrete GPU. And NVIDIA, typically is what you're going to find in the laptop model. So that's something to look out for there. Memory. The interesting thing about memory these days is it's typically soldered onto the motherboard. Once you buy it, you don't get a chance to upgrade it. So this is the time to choose the amount you need, because you're going to be stuck with it. In general, I recommend for our readers, the kind of people who are using a laptop for business purposes, that 8 gigabytes is a minimum. And that's adequate for almost all productivity users. 16 gigabytes is essential if you're doing video processing or if you intend to run virtual machines. And if you're doing heavy duty work, especially if you're a developer, you might want to look for one of the very few types of laptops out there that will allow you to configure the device with 32 gigabytes of RAM.
I think, Ed, really quick, I think that's a really important point that you just raised about virtual machines. If hopefully most of our audience that are IT professionals, they understand that RAM is going to get split up between the virtual machines. So if you want to run intensive applications on one of those VMs, and you're also running intensive applications on a host operating system, you may think that 8 megabits of RAM will get you there, but it's going to run down to 4 real quick.
Right, exactly. 16 gigabytes, I think, is the sort of magic number for virtual machines, because you can split that down the middle, and you basically say, I'm going to assign 8 gigabytes to my virtual machine and 8 gigabytes to my to the tasks that I'm running alongside that, and you can flip back and forth, and you've got two fairly decent productivity machines there. If you want, you can even configure the virtual machine to use up to 12, 13, 14 gigabytes of RAM if you set it up to be variable there, so that it can use and release the RAM as needed. But you don't get those options. If you start with only 8 gigabytes, you don't get those options. You will find, by the way, bargain PCs that have only 4 gigabytes of RAM, and I just don't recommend those except for really lightweight consumer use. They would be fine for for my mom, or for a family member who just wants to use it to go on Facebook and occasionally check their bank balance. But for getting actual work done, start at 8, and if you're not certain, then go to 16. So then the last spec that we should talk about here is storage. For a while there, at the beginning of the Windows 10 era, Microsoft was encouraging OEMs to sell machines that had as little as 32 gigabytes of storage. That turned out to be a disaster. Anybody who got one of those devices is really struggling with it, these days. You can still find some devices that have 64 gigabytes of storage, but I would not recommend that either, even if you make judicious use of cloud storage. My basic recommendation is, first of all, make sure it's solid state storage, SSD or NVMe. Secondly, 128 gigabytes is the bare minimum, and that's if you're not doing a lot of video work and you're making really good use of the cloud. But if you have any anxiety about running out of disk space, bumping up to 256 gigabytes or even 512 gigabytes, this is the time to do it when you're initially speccing the machine, because making that upgrade later usually isn't an option.
Yeah, and that's something that I don't think a lot of people take into consideration. Maybe if they bought laptops in the past, right? Old laptops, we were just chatting before the show that, we've been doing this for quite a while, and it used to be that you could take the RAM out, you could take the hard drives out, you could swap components. That really isn't possible with today's ultra thin laptops, whether they're MacBooks, whether they're Windows machines. Oftentimes those components are soldered directly to the logic boards, so you can't remove them. So it's a one-shot deal when you buy it.
Right, and all that engineering is what makes these devices so thin and light. But it also means that, yeah, there are some models that you can take apart. It takes you got to take like 10 little screws off them with just exactly the right Torx tool, and you take those things off, and then you very carefully pry things apart, and you might be able to get to a storage module that you could replace. But that's not really something that I would recommend for most people. And the amount of money that you could save doing that compared to just speccing it from day one, it just isn't enough to justify probably invalidating the warranty and risking damaging something while you've got that thing taken apart. So spec it for what you need, and give yourself a little headroom. There's no such thing as future proofing, but you can at least think about your future self and your future needs.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about storage at the end there. My phone has 512 gigs of RAM, or gigs of storage. And if you've got a phone that allows you to expand the internal storage with a micro SSD card, or a micro SD card, you can get a terabyte of storage on your phone. So if you're using it on your mobile device, it's probably a pretty good idea to get at least, comparable on your laptop and not skim.
Absolutely.
Ed, one of my favorite laptops of all times was an 11-inch MacBook Air that I had from like 2015. It was pretty powerful. I got it spec'd so that I could do photo editing on it, not really a lot of video editing. But what I liked about it was the form factor. It was the size. It was the fact that when I could get on a plane, I could open the lid, and even if someone reclined the seat, it wouldn't push it down. That's kind of an intangible feature that you may not think about when you're buying a laptop. But after using it for years and years and years, and I still have it, I still use it occasionally, even though it's not the most powerful machine I have, I still love the form factor. So what are those intangibles, or those things that people often don't think about when they're buying a laptop, but really make a big difference once they get it?
Right. I had one of those MacBook Airs also. And one of the things that made them such a pleasure to use was the keyboard. And what we're seeing now, both in the latest generation of Macs, after a couple of years there where the keyboards weren't so good,
Yeah, they were pretty
uh,
bad.
is you're seeing both Windows PC makers and Apple once again designing really good keyboards and touchpads, but they're different. So, for example, I have two Dell units here that been evaluating for the last couple months. One is from the business side, a Latitude 7400 2-in-1, and the other is from the consumer side. It's an XPS 13. They have very, very different keyboards to them. The one is a very clicky experience, and some people really like that. The other one has a much deeper travel to it, and it's very quiet. And neither one of those is either a right or wrong design. It's a matter of personal preference. And so one of the things that I suggest to people is that when you're buying a new PC, that you insist on a 14-day no questions asked return policy, so that things like the keyboard and touchpad, you can try them out and make sure that they work for you. Because if they don't, you're just going to be miserable with it for a long time. With on a PC, you absolutely want to make sure that it has what's called a precision touchpad, because that gives you the maximum amount of control over it in Windows 10 settings. There's also the question of network connectivity. We're in the throes of another transition with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Now we're going from 802.11 AC to AX now, the Wi-Fi 6, and Bluetooth is coming up on version 5, Bluetooth 5, the low energy stuff. Now the good news about those is that there's so much infrastructure for the older versions of both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi that you don't have to worry about getting the latest standard for either of those. But especially in terms of Bluetooth, I would say that you're better off getting the Bluetooth 5 with the full low energy support, because more and more of the peripherals you start to use over the next few years are going to support that. And then my final recommendation, and the thing that for me, it's just one of those things that once you use it, you realize how invaluable it is biometric authentication. So there's fingerprint readers, which are getting better and better now. If everyone's got experience with the kind that took 6 tries to try and get it to read your fingerprint, and then it would fail, and you'd have to enter your password anyway. They're much better there now, but I still prefer the Windows Hello infrared cameras. That's on the Surface Book 2 that I'm talking to you on right now. It's on Dell models and Lenovo models. It's usually on the higher end premium models, and it usually adds up to a couple extra bucks there. But boy, it is just magical to be able to open the lid, have the machine come on and recognize you and log you in just like that. So that's the final thing. That's my list, and I think it covers almost all the things. There's a few things that you might also want to take into consideration, ports, and webcams, webcam resolution and stuff like that. But this to me is the big list. And if you go through that list and make sure that you take all that stuff into account, you're going to wind up making the right decision, I think.
Well, Ed, thank you very much. That's a great list of tips when you're buying a new laptop. Just to remind folks, they can see Ed's article on ZDNet with every one of these items laid out, and a lot more information there. They can also check out Tech Republic, where they can subscribe to our Windows Weekly newsletter, where they can get a weekly Windows tip from Ed.